when Walter Hayes collapsed onto the cold tile of an electronics store. Laughter rose before anyone offered help. Phones were lifted. A one-legged veteran lay exposed while his old military dog stood frozen at his side, ready to defend, but waiting for a command that never came. Walter didn't shout. He didn't beg. He only whispered, "Not today," as the world looked away. He didn't know that this moment of humiliation would awaken a chain of quiet miracles, nor that God was already moving through strangers, silence, and sacrifice to change what this day would mean forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to Angels in Uniform for more stories of faith, courage, and unseen heroes. The sound did not belong in a place like this. It was too dry, too blunt, too honest. A single clack echoed across the polished white tile of the electronics store, cutting through the soft hum of air conditioning and background music engineered to make people spend money. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Fingers froze above glowing screens. For a fraction of a second, everyone turned toward the sound, without knowing why their bodies had reacted faster than their thoughts. Walter Hayes lay on his side near the laptop display, one palm pressed against the cold floor, the other reaching instinctively for balance that was no longer there. He was 74, thin to the point of fragility, his shoulders narrow beneath a faded olive-green jacket that had once fit better decades ago. His hair was cut short, white and practical, the way men kept it when vanity had been replaced by habit. Deep lines ran through his face, not the soft wrinkles of age alone, but the sharper creases of long-held tension. His mouth was set in a way that suggested restraint rather than pride, as if words had learned not to come easily anymore. The clack came again as he shifted slightly. This time it was unmistakable. Not bone, not glass. The sound of synthetic material striking tile. His prosthetic leg, metal and matte plastic dulled by years of use, had slipped awkwardly beneath him. A few people in the crowd realized what they were seeing, and the laughter that followed was not cruel in intention, only careless. Carelessness, however, has its own weight. Phones rose almost automatically. The reflex had become cultural. Record first, decide later. Beside Walter stood a German shepherd, large but unmistakably old. Ranger's muzzle was dusted with gray, his once glossy black and brown coat slightly uneven with age. One ear tilted lower than the other, the result of an injury long healed but never forgotten by the body. His stance was rigid, not aggressive, not fearful, simply prepared. His eyes never left Walter. They did not dart toward the laughing crowd or the employee who hovered nearby, uncertain and irritated. Ranger watched only the man on the floor, muscles tense, as if awaiting a signal no one else could see. Walter drew a slow breath, then another. He did not curse. He did not ask for help. He did not even look around at the people staring down at him. Instead, he lifted his head just enough to meet Ranger's gaze. His voice, when it came, was barely louder than a breath. "No, not today." Ranger's tail lowered. He did not move. Walter pushed himself upright with deliberate care, adjusting the prosthetic with practiced efficiency. His movements were slow, but not clumsy. The kind of slowness that came from knowing exactly how much strength remained and refusing to waste it. No one stepped forward to assist. Someone cleared their throat. Another person laughed nervously, then stopped when the sound felt wrong in their own ears. An employee lingered. Nearby, a young man with sharp features and a trimmed beard, irritation etched into his brow. He said nothing now, only watched, arms folded, as if waiting for the inconvenience to resolve itself. Walter reached down and picked up his glasses. The lenses were scratched, the thin metal frame bent slightly at the bridge. He wiped them on the hem of his jacket before placing them back on his face, though they did little to improve his vision. Ranger stepped half a pace closer, positioning himself subtly between Walter and the nearest stranger, a habit ingrained deeper than training. For a moment, the store resumed its noise. Conversations restarted. Someone muttered something about people not watching where they're going. The world moved on with startling speed. Then the scene fractured. A dim bedroom replaced the fluorescent lights. A narrow closet door creaked open. Inside, 2 American flags sat folded into precise triangles, their edges sharp, their stars hidden, their presence heavy. The image lasted only a heartbeat before dissolving. Another cut. A small wooden table. 2 photographs face down, their corners worn, the backs yellowed with age. The viewer never saw the faces, only the deliberate way they were turned away from sight. Another cut. A tin box, dented, its paint chipped, opened by hands that trembled just enough to be noticed. Coins spilled into a palm. A few wrinkled bills followed. The sound they made was softer than the clack on the tile, but somehow heavier. Another cut. A cracked phone screen lighting up in the dark. 1 missed call. The name at the top, Dad. Beneath it, a message that had never been answered. Walter blinked, and the electronics store returned around him. He was standing now. Ranger pressed close to his left side, the side where the prosthetic joined his body with a quiet finality. Walter's jaw tightened. He nodded once, not to anyone in particular, and began to walk. His gait was uneven but steady. Each step produced a faint mechanical sound, barely audible beneath the store's music. But to Walter, it was thunderous. He stopped near a laptop perched on a pristine white table. The device gleamed, untouched, its price tag displayed without shame. Walter did not reach for it. He stared at the number instead, swallowing hard. Ranger sat at his side without being told. A strange thing happened then. Something no one noticed except Walter. Ranger tilted his head sharply, ears pricked, eyes fixed not on the laptop or the people, but on the store's glass entrance. For a split second, his body tensed as if reacting to something unseen. A presence. A memory. A warning. Walter felt it too. A tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with age. His fingers curled around the edge of the tin box in his pocket. This was the rehook moment, though no one would have named it that. It was simply the sense that something unseen had shifted, that a line had been crossed, or perhaps remembered. Walter leaned down slightly and rested his hand on Ranger's neck. "Stay," he murmured. Ranger obeyed, but his eyes never softened. A voice sounded behind them, younger, impatient. "Sir, you can't touch the displays if you're not buying." Walter turned. The words sat between them like an accusation. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Explanations had a way of becoming confessions when one grew old. He chose silence instead. He removed the tin box from his pocket and held it for a moment without opening it. The metal felt cold against his skin. He imagined the weight of it spilling onto the floor, the way the coins would scatter, the way people would stare. He imagined Ranger flinching at the sound. "Not here," he whispered, so quietly that only Ranger heard. Walter turned away from the laptop. His foot caught slightly, producing one last, unmistakable clack on the tile. The sound followed him like an echo as he walked toward the exit, shoulders squared, back straight, refusing to rush. As the automatic doors slid open, light from outside spilled in, warmer, kinder. Walter paused just long enough to glance back at the row of laptops, then down at the tin box, then at Ranger. He did not know yet how this day would end. He only knew that once, long ago, he had signed something that changed everything, and that the echo of that signature still followed him, as relentless as the sound of metal on tile. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you believe that God still works through quiet moments, unseen courage, and small miracles, please like, share, and comment below. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where we honor faith, sacrifice, and the grace that finds us, even when the world looks away. Walter did not go straight home after leaving the electronics store. He walked 2 extra blocks, slower than usual, letting the cold air settle his breathing and quiet the echo of laughter that still rang inside his skull. Ranger stayed glued to his left side, matching his uneven pace, nails clicking softly on the sidewalk, head occasionally lifting as if checking the world for threats that never fully disappeared. When they finally reached the small house at the end of Cedar Street, the porch light was already on. It flickered once, then steadied, a tired bulb doing its best to stay useful. Inside, the house smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. It was clean but worn, like a place that had been cared for without ever being upgraded. Noah was at the small kitchen table, hunched over a spiral notebook, pencil moving in careful lines. He was 15, tall for his age, but still narrow, all elbows and knees, his brown hair falling into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. There was something gentle in his face that made people underestimate him, a softness that came from learning early how to be quiet when others were tired. He looked up when the door closed, relief flashing across his features before he quickly hid it. "You're back," Noah said, standing too fast, chair legs scraping. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone who worried constantly but hated showing it. Walter nodded, setting his jacket over the back of the chair. He avoided Noah's eyes, not because he was hiding something specific, but because looking too long always made him afraid he might say the wrong thing. Ranger circled once and lay down near the bedroom doorway, positioning himself so he could see both the hall and the kitchen, chin resting on his paws. "How'd it go?" Noah asked, trying to sound casual. Walter shrugged, the movement small. "Busy," he said. It was not a lie. It was simply incomplete. Noah glanced at Ranger, then back at Walter. He hesitated, fingers whirring the edge of his notebook. "It's okay if we wait," he said finally. "I mean, I don't really need it right now. The school computers work fine." He forced a smile, too quick, too rehearsed. "Besides, I like doing things the old way." Walter felt the words hit somewhere deep and sharp. He turned away under the pretense of rinsing his hands at the sink, letting the water run longer than necessary. He watched his reflection in the small window above the basin, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, practiced. "We'll see," he said. "Doesn't hurt to look." Noah nodded, relieved that the subject was closing, and bent back over his notebook. Walter watched him for a moment longer than necessary, taking in the way Noah's pencil paused every few seconds, the way his brow furrowed as if the world were already asking him questions that required adult answers. Then Walter moved to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. The bedroom was sparse. A narrow bed, a dresser with mismatched handles, and a small table by the window. Walter sat on the edge of the bed and removed the tin box from his jacket pocket. It was heavier than it looked, not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. He opened it slowly, the hinge squeaking in protest, and poured the contents onto the table. Coins scattered, dull and tired. Bills lay folded, creased from being handled too many times. He counted once, lips moving silently, then counted again to be sure. The number did not change. He added a folded 20 from his wallet, pressing it flat with his palm as if that might make it worth more. He closed the box and slid it back into the drawer, careful to push it behind the socks so it would not be the first thing seen. Outside the bedroom, the house grew quiet. Noah finished his homework and went to bed without saying much more. His usual good night replaced by a quick hug that Walter did not expect but did not resist. Ranger followed Noah to the hallway, then returned to his post by the bedroom door, lying down with a soft grunt that sounded almost like a sigh. Later that night, when the house had settled into its familiar creaks and hums, Walter lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Noah's breathing through the thin wall, slow and even. Ranger shifted once, nails scraping lightly, then went still. Walter reached for the drawer without looking and opened it just enough to slide out the tin box again. This time, he did not count the money. He simply held it, letting the cold metal ground him. A sound broke the quiet. Soft. Wrong. Ranger lifted his head abruptly, ears pricking, body tensing. He stood without noise and moved toward the front door, not barking, not growling, just watching. Walter sat up, heart pounding, every sense sharpening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ranger relaxed, tail lowering, and returned to his place by the door, curling back down as if satisfied. Walter exhaled slowly. He did not know what Ranger had sensed, only that whatever it was had passed. The moment lingered, strange and heavy, like a warning that chose not to speak. The next morning, Noah left early for school. Walter watched from the window as he walked down the street, backpack slung low, hoodie zipped against the cold. Only after the door closed did Walter notice the zipper pocket on the backpack hanging slightly open. Something white peeked out. Paper. He frowned, but did not go after him. Later, when Walter swept the floor, he found it near the door. An envelope, thin and official-looking, addressed in clean black print. He picked it up, thumb brushing the edge. He did not open it. Instead, he slid it onto the table beside the tin box, the two objects sitting together like pieces of a puzzle he was afraid to complete. That afternoon, Walter walked to a small pawn shop 3 streets over. The sign above the door was faded, the window cluttered with guitars, missing strings, and watches that no longer told time. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old metal. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, heavy-set, with thinning hair and kind eyes dulled by years of seeing people trade pieces of their lives for cash. He nodded when Walter entered, recognition flickering. "What can I do for you?" the man asked gently. Walter did not answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around something he had carried for years without touching. When he placed it on the counter, his fingers lingered, reluctant. The object itself remained partially hidden by his palm. The man leaned forward, eyes softening. "You sure?" he asked quietly. Walter nodded once. He did not trust his voice. The exchange was brief. No haggling, no questions. Walter accepted the money, folding it carefully, and left without looking back. Outside, Ranger waited, tail thumping once against the pavement when he saw Walter. They walked home in silence. That night, Walter added the new bills to the tin box. The amount finally looked like something that could become something else. He closed the lid, his hand steady now, though his chest ached. From the hallway, Noah's voice drifted in, half asleep. "Good night, Grandpa." Walter paused, then answered softly, "Good night, kiddo." As the house settled, Ranger lay once more at the bedroom door, a silent sentinel. Walter stared at the ceiling and thought of the envelope, the box, the sound of coins, and the quiet lies that kept the world from falling apart. The money in the tin box did not come from labor alone. It came from letting go of things that were never meant to be sold, and the weight of that truth pressed down on him, heavy and unresolved. If you believe that God sees even the smallest sacrifices, that miracles sometimes begin with quiet lies told out of love, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where faith and grace walk beside those who carry unseen burdens. Walter returned to the electronics store the next afternoon because turning back felt worse than going forward. The envelope Noah had dropped sat heavy in his jacket pocket, unopened, its presence pressing against his ribs like a reminder that time was narrowing. Ranger walked beside him as always, shoulder brushing Walter's thigh, their pace synchronized by years of quiet dependence. The automatic doors slid open with the same artificial cheer as before, releasing a wash of cold air and brightness that made Walter blink. Everything inside gleamed, screens polished, floors spotless, smiles rehearsed. It was a place designed to make people feel either powerful or invisible, and Walter already knew which one he was going to be. He moved slowly down the aisle of laptops, his prosthetic leg producing a faint, irregular sound against the tile. The clack was subtle at first, easy to miss beneath the store's music, but to Walter it felt amplified, each step announcing something he would rather keep private. Ranger stayed close, head level, eyes alert, his presence both a comfort and a liability in a place that saw animals as inconveniences. A few shoppers glanced at the dog, then at Walter's clothes. His faded jacket, worn shoes, the careful way he avoided touching anything unless absolutely necessary. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to dismissal with barely a pause. Near the display table stood the same employee from before, Kyle. He was in his mid-20s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and a trimmed beard that suggested effort rather than ease. His hair was styled neatly, the kind of neatness that came from trying to look in control. Kyle had grown up learning that mistakes were expensive. His father's temper had taught him that early, leaving him with a reflexive defensiveness he carried into adulthood. When he saw Walter approach again, irritation tightened his jaw before he could stop it. "You again," Kyle muttered under his breath, loud enough to be heard. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Walter and the nearest laptop, arms crossing instinctively. "Sir, I told you yesterday. These displays aren't for—" He gestured vaguely, eyes flicking to Ranger, then back to Walter's uneven stance. "You can't just wander around." Walter stopped. He felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but something close to shame. He had faced men with guns, shouted commands into chaos, made decisions that altered lives. Yet here he stood, tongue heavy, words refusing to line up. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Explaining required energy he did not have. "I'm just looking," he said finally, his voice low, measured, the way he spoke when he didn't trust himself to speak louder. Kyle scoffed. "Looking costs money," he said. A few people nearby laughed, the sound light and careless. Someone raised a phone, pretending to check messages while angling the camera just enough to capture the scene. Ranger shifted, muscles tightening, a low sound vibrating in his chest. It was not a growl, more a warning hum, restrained but unmistakable. Walter felt it through the leash and immediately shortened his grip. "Easy," he murmured. Ranger stilled, though his eyes never left Kyle. Kyle took a step back, startled, then recovered too quickly. "See?" he said loudly. "This is exactly why you shouldn't bring animals in here." His hand shot out, not toward Ranger, but toward Walter's shoulder, pushing him away from the display with unnecessary force. Walter stumbled, his foot caught at the wrong angle, prosthetic slipping on the polished floor. For a heartbeat, he flailed, arms reaching for balance that wasn't there. Then he fell. The sound was unmistakable. A sharp, hollow clack as metal met tile, followed by a dull thud as Walter's body hit the floor. The store went quiet, not out of concern, but out of fascination. Phones came up in unison now, no pretense remaining. A woman gasped, then covered her mouth, eyes wide but unmoving. Walter lay on his side, breath knocked from him, the world tilting. Pain flared along his hip, sharp but distant, overshadowed by something heavier. His pant leg had ridden up, exposing the prosthetic in full view, metal joints, worn casing, the truth of his body laid bare for strangers. He closed his eyes briefly, not to block out the pain, but to block out the eyes. Ranger lunged forward, stopping inches from Kyle. Teeth bared in a silent snarl. His leash went taut, the sound of leather stretching cutting through the silence. The dog's gaze was fierce, protective, ancient. It was the look of something that had learned, long ago, that hesitation could mean death. "Ranger," Walter said hoarsely. The command was barely audible, but it was enough. Ranger froze, then slowly backed away, positioning himself beside Walter's head, standing guard. His body trembled with restraint. No one moved to help, not the shoppers, not the employees. Kyle stood rooted, face pale now, staring at the prosthetic as if seeing it for the first time. A flicker of doubt crossed his expression, too brief to soften his posture, but enough to unsettle him. Walter pushed himself up onto one elbow. His chest rose and fell unevenly. He could feel the phones inches from his face, hear whispered commentary, sense the narrative forming without his consent. He focused instead on Ranger's eyes, grounding himself in their steadiness. The world narrowed. For a moment, the store disappeared, replaced by another floor, another sound. The echo of an explosion rang in his ears, louder than the clack of metal. He smelled smoke, tasted grit. He remembered lying on his side like this, weight pressing into his ribs, someone shouting his name through the ringing. The memory surged unbidden, vivid and cruel. The re-hook moment came then, subtle but powerful. Ranger suddenly lowered his head and pressed it against Walter's exposed prosthetic, a gesture so gentle it broke something open inside him. The dog did not look at the crowd. He did not snarl. He simply leaned in, grounding Walter in the present as if to say, "You're here. You survived. Stay." Walter swallowed hard. His vision blurred, not from pain, but from the weight of memory colliding with humiliation. He adjusted the prosthetic with shaking hands, pulling the fabric back down as best he could. A young woman nearby shifted uncomfortably, lowering her phone at last, but she did not step forward. Kyle cleared his throat. I didn't mean," he began, then stopped, words failing him now. His pride bristled, fighting with something like regret. Walter got to his feet slowly, using the display table for support. He did not look at Kyle. He did not look at anyone. He clipped Ranger's leash shorter and turned toward the exit, each step deliberate, each clack of the prosthetic echoing in his head like punctuation. As he reached the doors, someone laughed nervously behind him, the sound chasing him out into the daylight. The automatic doors slid shut, sealing the moment inside. Outside, the air was warmer, forgiving. Walter leaned against the brick wall, eyes closed, breathing until the shaking in his hands subsided. Ranger sat beside him, pressing his body close, a solid weight against Walter's leg. Walter opened his eyes and stared at the pavement. His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for himself and the dog. "The last time I was on the ground like that," he said slowly, "there was an explosion." Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, as if the word itself carried weight. Walter looked down at him, something unreadable in his eyes. The past was not done with him yet. He knew that now more than ever. If this moment stirred anger or compassion in you, if you believe that God stands with the broken and the humiliated, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where stories of quiet courage remind us that miracles often begin where dignity seems lost. Walter did not speak much after leaving the electronics store. He walked home with Ranger in silence, each step measured, the sound of his prosthetic softer now, absorbed by the rough pavement and the wind moving through the trees. By the time they reached the house, dusk had settled, turning the windows into mirrors that reflected only shadows. Inside, the lights stayed off. Walter preferred it that way. Darkness made fewer demands. He sat at the small kitchen table, elbows resting on the scarred wood, hands folded as if waiting for permission to move. Ranger lay at his feet, head up, eyes alert, tracking every shift in Walter's breathing. The dog was old, his movements slower than they once were, his muzzle pale with gray. But there was nothing dulled about his attention. Time had not softened Ranger. It had sharpened him into something precise and watchful. Walter closed his eyes, and the kitchen slipped away. The first sound was not an explosion, but a voice, crackling through a radio, distorted by distance and interference. It was his voice, younger, steadier, carrying authority he barely recognized anymore. The memory arrived in fragments, refusing to line up into a full picture. Heat, dust, the weight of gear pressing into his shoulders. Ranger at his side, lean and powerful then, muscles coiled, eyes bright and intent. "Hold," the voice said. His voice. The radio hissed. Someone else spoke. Another voice, urgent, breaking. A warning, maybe, or a plea. Walter could never remember which. He opened his eyes, heart pounding, and stared at the darkened kitchen. Ranger shifted closer, his body pressing against Walter's shin, grounding him. Walter reached down without looking, fingers finding the familiar curve of Ranger's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and real. The memory refused to retreat. There was a street, narrow and broken, buildings crowding in like witnesses. Ranger had moved ahead, low and focused, reading the ground in a way no human ever could. Walter had trusted him with his life. He always had. The radio crackled again, static chewing at the edges of words. Walter remembered hesitating, the smallest pause, just long enough for doubt to slip in. He had been trained to decide quickly, to trust his instincts, but instinct had failed him once before, years earlier, and that failure had taught him caution at a terrible cost. "Wait," he had said then. One word, one breath. The blast came anyway. Walter's chest tightened as the memory surged. He could feel the concussion in his bones, hear the ringing that drowned out everything else. He remembered the ground rushing up, the sensation of weightlessness followed by impact. He remembered Ranger barking, sharp and urgent, his voice cutting through the chaos. He remembered smoke, the taste of metal, the smell of burning rubber. Back in the present, Walter's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale, each exhale. Ranger watched him closely, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. "No one else dies," Walter whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He had said that before. Said it like a promise, like a command that could bend the world if spoken firmly enough. But the world had not listened. The door to Noah's room creaked softly as the boy shifted in his sleep. The sound anchored Walter briefly in the present. He stood and moved toward the bedroom, careful not to wake him. Noah lay sprawled across the bed, one arm flung over his pillow, hair falling into his eyes. His face was peaceful in sleep, unburdened by the calculations of the day. Walter watched him for a long moment, chest aching with a mixture of love and dread. He wondered, not for the first time, how long innocence could survive proximity to him. He returned to the living room and sat heavily in his chair. The radio memory came back stronger now, dragging more detail with it. There had been shouting. Someone had been out of position. Someone had moved too soon. Walter could see it clearly now. A figure stepping into the street, weapon raised, confidence outweighing caution. A familiar silhouette. His son. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Walter sucked in a sharp breath, his vision blurring. He had known this truth for years, carried it quietly. But the store, the fall, the laughter, they had stripped away his defenses. The memory sharpened until it cut. He had known his son was on that mission. He had known it when he gave the order. Protocol said it shouldn't have mattered. Command was command. But blood complicated everything. He had told himself he was being fair, that treating his son like any other soldier was the right thing. He had believed that professionalism could shield him from consequence. The radio crackled again in his memory. Someone shouted his name. Not sir, not command, but Dad. The word was brief, nearly lost in the noise, but it landed with devastating clarity. The rehook moment arrived quietly, almost reverently. Ranger, who had been lying still, suddenly stood and walked to the old radio sitting unused on the shelf. He raised his nose to it, sniffing once, then pressed his forehead against the cold plastic. The radio was dead, disconnected for years, yet Ranger lingered there, tail still, body tense. Walter stared, a chill running through him. For a fleeting second, it felt as though the past had found a crack in the present, a place to breathe. Walter stood slowly and crossed the room. He knelt beside Ranger, ignoring the protest of his joints, and rested his forehead against the dog's. "It's over," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. The memory continued, relentless. After the blast, Walter had crawled forward, dragging himself through debris, Ranger close, teeth gripping his vest to keep him moving. He had found his son where the street narrowed, the Sa'a world reduced to blood and dust. He had tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but words had failed him then too. His son's eyes had been open, calm in a way that broke something fundamental inside Walter. He had wanted to promise that it meant something, that the sacrifice was not wasted. But even then, he had known promises were fragile things. In the present, Walter sank back into his chair, the weight of years pressing down. He stared at the floor, seeing again the moment his leg had gone numb, the realization that the pain he felt was not where it should be. He remembered Ranger pulling him back, ignoring shouted commands, choosing him over the mission without hesitation. Ranger had disobeyed perfectly. Walter laughed once, a short, broken sound. "You always knew better," he murmured. The clock ticked on the wall, each second another reminder that time did not care about guilt. Walter closed his eyes again, but this time he did not resist the memory. He let it wash over him, the radio, the voices, the order given too late or too soon. It no longer mattered which. What mattered was the outcome. Someone had died, more than one someone, and he had lived. He opened his eyes and looked toward Noah's room. His voice was barely audible. "That mission," he said to the empty room, to Ranger, to the ghosts he carried. "My son was there." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. If this chapter stirred your heart, if you believe that God hears the prayers we whisper too late and still offers grace, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where stories of faith and sacrifice remind us that even broken orders can lead us back to mercy. Walter did not go home right away, but after the memories of the night before finally loosened their grip, morning came gray and quiet, and with it a heaviness that settled into his bones like cold. He left the house while Noah was still asleep, closing the door softly behind him. Ranger followed without a sound, his movements slower than in years past, but still deliberate, still purposeful. The dog was old now, 12, maybe 13. But age had only stripped away his excess energy, not his awareness. His coat, once deep black and rich brown, had faded around the muzzle, and his eyes carried a patience that felt earned rather than learned. They crossed the street together, not toward the bright electronics store that had already claimed too much of Walter's pride, but toward a smaller shop tucked between a dry cleaner and a shuttered bakery. The sign above the door read, "Oakline Tech Repair," its lettering chipped, one corner hanging slightly crooked. The window display was modest. A few refurbished laptops, tangled cords, handwritten prices taped to the glass. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing unless they were looking for something specific, or unless they had nowhere else to go. Inside, the light was warm. Not bright, not dim, just enough to soften the edges of things. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old plastic. Behind the counter stood a young man, no older than 22. His name was Evan Brooks, though Walter did not know that yet. Evan was tall but slightly hunched, as if he had grown too quickly and never quite adjusted. His hair was dark blonde, cut unevenly, the result of doing it himself to save money. A light dusting of freckles crossed his nose, and his skin carried the pale tone of someone who spent more time indoors than out. His eyes, however, were open and steady, curious without being intrusive. Evan looked up from a disassembled laptop and smiled, not the rehearsed kind, but the reflexive one people used when they were genuinely glad to see another human being. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm, unhurried. "What can I help you with?" Walter hesitated at the threshold, one hand resting on Ranger's leash. No one told him dogs weren't allowed. No one stared at his leg. Evan's gaze flicked briefly to Ranger, then back to Walter's face, as if the dog were simply part of the picture, not a problem to be solved. "I was just looking," Walter said. The words familiar by now. Evan nodded. "Take your time." He gestured toward the row of refurbished laptops. "If you want to sit, go ahead. They're all on." Walter moved forward cautiously, expecting at any moment to be stopped, corrected, measured. It did not happen. He lowered himself into the chair slowly, Ranger settling beside him with a quiet grunt. The dog leaned in close, his shoulder touching Walter's shin, the contact steady and grounding. Walter stared at the laptop in front of him, hands resting uselessly on his thighs. He had imagined this moment so many times, choosing something that might change Noah's future. But now that it was here, his chest felt tight. The prices were lower than across the street, but still high enough to matter. Evan watched from a respectful distance. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone softer. "Is it for you or someone else?" "My grandson," Walter said before he could stop himself. The truth slipped out, unguarded. Evan smiled. "Lucky kid," he said. "What's he studying?" Walter shrugged. "Everything," he said quietly. "He's good with numbers, fixes things." Evan nodded as if that mattered. "Then this one might work," he said, turning the screen slightly. "Not fancy, but solid." Battery holds up. I use the same model for school. Walter glanced up, surprised. You're in school? Community college, Evan replied. Nights. I fix computers during the day. He smiled again, a little sheepish. Pays the bills. Walter nodded, understanding more than Evan knew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the tin box, setting it gently on the counter. The metal made a soft sound, nothing like the clack of his prosthetic, but it still made him flinch. Evan's eyes flicked to the box, then immediately away. He did not ask to open it. He did not ask how much was inside. Instead, he asked a question so simple it caught Walter off guard. Sir, Evan said quietly, meeting Walter's eyes for the first time. Are you in pain? The words landed harder than any insult. Walter's breath caught. His throat tightened, and for a moment he could not speak. Pain was something he had learned to catalog, to rank, to endure. No one had asked him about it in years. Not like this, without agenda or assumption. Walter began, then stopped. His vision blurred. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking once before he could stop them. The sound that escaped him was small, almost childlike, and it surprised them both. Ranger reacted instantly. He lifted his head and, with deliberate care, placed it against Walter's prosthetic leg. Not his knee, not his hand, but the artificial limb itself. The contact was gentle, grounding, an acknowledgement without judgment. Evan watched, throat tight, understanding without words. Walter took a deep breath, then another. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet but clear. I'm all right, he said hoarsely. Most days. Evan nodded. He did not press. Whenever you're ready, he said, gesturing to the box. Walter opened it. He poured the contents onto the counter slowly, each coin and bill a quiet confession. Evan counted silently, careful not to rush. When he finished, he paused. It's close, Evan said. Not quite enough for this one. But he stopped himself, glancing at Walter's face. Let me show you something. He disappeared into the back room and returned with another laptop. This one was older, the Adastin casing scuffed, but clean. I fixed this one last week, Evan said. Runs fine, not pretty, but it'll do what your grandson needs. Walter looked at it, hope and fear colliding in his chest. I don't want charity, he said firmly. Evan shook his head. It's not, he said. You're paying for it. Just not all with money. The re-hook moment came quietly then. Ranger lifted his head suddenly and looked toward the ceiling, ears pricked, tail still. For a brief second, sunlight broke through the clouds outside, streaming through the window and illuminating the counter, the tin box, the laptop. Evan noticed it too, blinking in surprise. Neither said anything, but the moment lingered, heavy with something unspoken. Walter closed his eyes briefly. I need to tell you something, he said. Not everything, just enough. Evan waited. I didn't earn all that money the way people think, Walter continued. Some of it came from letting go of things I wasn't ready to lose. Evan nodded. He did not ask what those things were. Walter gathered the laptop into his arms, carefully, as if it were fragile. He stood slowly, Ranger rising with him. Thank you, he said. It felt inadequate, but it was all he had. That night, Walter lay on the couch, pretending to sleep. Noah padded out of his room quietly, a blanket in his hands. He draped it over Walter's shoulders with care, unaware that Walter's eyes were open, watching. Ranger lay nearby, head resting once more against the prosthetic leg, guarding the quiet. Walter stared at the ceiling, heart full and aching. He had told only half the truth. The rest waited, heavy and unavoidable. If this moment touched you, if you believe that God often answers us through kindness and quiet mercy, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where faith and small miracles meet those who need them most. Walter did not sleep that night. He lay on the couch with the blanket Noah had placed over him, eyes open, staring at the dim line of light beneath the bedroom door. Ranger remained at his side, his breathing slow and steady, a metronome anchoring the room. The laptop sat on the small table across from them, closed, its presence both hopeful and heavy. Walter had not opened it yet. Some gifts felt too sacred to touch immediately. When morning came, it brought with it a silence that felt deliberate. Noah left early for school, careful not to wake him, whispering goodbye to Ranger instead. The house emptied, and Walter found himself alone with the things he had spent years avoiding. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and crossed to the bedroom closet. The door creaked as he opened it, a sound he had learned to dread. Inside, the 2 folded flags rested on the top shelf, precise and immaculate, the fabric still holding the shape of ceremony. They were identical, except for the weight Walter felt in his chest when he looked at each one. He reached up and touched them, fingertips brushing the crisp folds as if they might burn him. He lowered himself onto the bed and sat there, the prosthetic leg angled slightly away, the way he always positioned it when he knew he would be there a while. Ranger followed and lay at his feet, eyes never leaving Walter's face. The dog was old, his movements economical, but there was nothing fragile about him. His gaze carried the calm certainty of something that had seen the worst and survived without explanation. Walter closed his eyes, and the past surged forward again, not as a blur this time, but as a sequence he could no longer interrupt. There had been 2 sons. The older one, Matthew, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a smile that came easily, had always tried to protect his younger brother, even as a child. He had joined the service first, driven by duty and a desire to make his father proud. The younger one, Jason, had followed years later, leaner, quicker, with eyes that asked questions before his mouth ever did. Jason had wanted answers. He had wanted to understand the world, not just survive it. Walter had raised them both to stand straight, to keep their word, to believe that service meant something. He had never told them how much fear lived beneath those lessons. The day of the call came back to him with brutal clarity. He had been checking equipment, Ranger nearby, the radio buzzing with updates. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at it once, saw Jason's name, and felt a tightening in his chest that he mistook for inconvenience. They were in the middle of preparations. Distractions were dangerous. He told himself he would call back in a few minutes after things settled. He told himself Jason would understand. He never did. The memory shifted, pulling him forward to the mission itself. Matthew had been killed months earlier, an IED tearing through a convoy before anyone could react. Walter had attended the ceremony in silence, hands clasped so tightly they ached. Ranger pressed against his leg, absorbing the tremor that ran through him. When Jason insisted on staying in, on finishing his rotation, else Walter had not argued. He had believed, foolishly, that fate would not be cruel twice. Jason's unit moved through a narrow street that morning, the kind of place where danger hid in plain sight. Walter listened through the radio, his voice steady as he relayed information. He heard Jason's voice once, clear and calm, calling out positions. He almost smiled. Then came the uncertainty, a shadow where there should have been nothing, a pause that stretched too long. Walter hesitated. It was not long enough for anyone else to notice, but it was long enough to matter. He chose caution, chose protocol, chose the decision that made sense on paper. The order went out. Too late or too early, it no longer mattered which. The blast tore through the street like judgment. Walter remembered the sound more than anything, the way it hollowed the air. He remembered Ranger barking, breaking formation to drag him back when his leg failed beneath him, teeth clamped onto his vest with desperate strength. He remembered crawling, the prosthetic leg useless, pain blooming and then vanishing entirely. He remembered reaching Jason and knowing before anyone said a word. In the present, Walter's hands curled into fists. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "I gave the right order," he said to the empty room, "but I was the wrong father." The rehook moment arrived unexpectedly. Ranger lifted his head and began to whine softly, a sound he rarely made. He stood and padded to the bedroom doorway, then stopped and looked back at Walter, eyes intent. Walter followed his gaze and noticed something he had not seen before. The closet door, which he was certain he had closed, stood slightly ajar. A thin beam of light cut across the flags on the shelf, illuminating the edge of one. It felt like a summons, gentle but insistent. Walter rose with effort and approached the closet. He removed one flag and held it against his chest, the weight of it immense despite its lightness. He did not know which son it represented anymore. In his mind, they had merged, two sacrifices bound together. He pressed his forehead to the folded fabric and closed his eyes. "If I had answered," he whispered, tears finally breaking free, "maybe the closet would be empty." The thought lodged itself in his chest and refused to move. He returned the flag carefully and turned away, leaning heavily on the dresser. Ranger moved to him immediately, pressing his body against Walter's prosthetic leg, grounding him once more. The dog's presence was unwavering, a reminder that loyalty sometimes meant staying even when everything hurt. Later that evening, Walter sat at the kitchen table with the envelope Noah had dropped days earlier. He opened it at last. Inside was an acceptance letter, words of encouragement and opportunity spilling out onto the page. Walter read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the tin box, the laptop, the flags, all the pieces of a life measured in sacrifice and hope. Noah came home quietly, sensing the weight in the air. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the open closet and the flags. His face paled, understanding dawning. Walter looked up, eyes red but clear. "I should have answered," Walter said simply. Noah crossed the room and wrapped his arms around his grandfather without a word. Walter held him, the ache in his chest sharp but honest. The truth had finally been spoken, even if it changed nothing. If this chapter left you holding your breath, if you believe that God hears the calls we miss and still offers mercy, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where faith reminds us that even unanswered calls can lead us back to grace. The house was quiet, in a way that felt earned rather than empty. Evening settled gently over Cedar Street, the kind of dusk that softened edges and forgave small imperfections. Walter sat at the kitchen table with the laptop closed in front of him, its surface catching the amber glow of the single overhead light. He had waited for Noah to finish dinner, waited for the clatter of dishes to fade, waited for the moment when speaking would not feel like an intrusion. Ranger lay nearby, curled into himself, old bones finally at rest, his breathing deep and even. Noah approached the table cautiously, as if the laptop might startle if touched too suddenly. He was taller now than Walter remembered being at that age, his shoulders still narrow but beginning to square. his face a careful mix of youth and responsibility. His hoodie sleeves were pulled over his hands, a habit he had developed when thinking hard. "Is that for me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. Walter nodded once. "It is." Noah hesitated. "You didn't have to," he said automatically, the words learned from years of watching scarcity-shape decisions. Walter met his eyes. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." Noah sat and lifted the lid slowly. The screen came alive, casting light across his face, illuminating the small scar near his eyebrow from a childhood fall Walter still remembered too clearly. Noah's breath caught. He swallowed, and then laughed softly, a sound that trembled with disbelief. "It's real," he said, almost to himself. Walter watched him, the knot in his chest loosening just a little. He did not mention the tin box, the pawn shop, the choices that had cost him sleep. Some gifts were diminished by explanation. Noah looked up, eyes shining. "Thank you, Grandpa." Walter nodded again. Words felt unnecessary. Across town, in the electronics store that gleamed even at night, Kyle sat alone in the break room, scrolling through his phone. He looked smaller without the counter between him and the world. His shoulders slumped, the sharpness in his face dulled by fatigue. He had replayed the video too many times, watching himself from an angle he didn't recognize, hearing his own voice carry disdain he had never admitted to owning. The comments had started pouring in hours ago. Most were angry, some were cruel. One stopped him cold. "My dad has a flag like that." Kyle stared at the words until they blurred. He closed the app and leaned back, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence. He thought of his own father, long gone, the anger that had shaped him into someone quick to defend and quicker to judge. For the first time, the memory did not excuse his behavior. It condemned it. Kyle lowered his head, shame settling in, heavy and late. There would be consequences tomorrow. He knew that now. Recognition had come too slowly to change anything that mattered. Back on Cedar Street, night deepened. Noah worked quietly at the laptop, fingers tentative at first, then more confident as the machine responded. Walter moved to the living room and lowered himself into his chair, exhaustion finally catching up. Ranger lifted his head briefly, tail thumping once in acknowledgement, then settled again, sleep claiming him fully for the first time that day. The rehook arrived softly, almost invisibly. The laptop chimed, a notification Noah hadn't expected. He frowned and turned the screen toward Walter. "Grandpa," he said, voice careful, "there's a message." Walter stood and approached, leaning slightly on the table. The email was brief, official, and kind. A scholarship confirmation, additional aid, enough to cover what they had feared would be impossible. Noah looked up, eyes wide. "I didn't think—" He stopped, words failing. Walter felt the room tilt, not with pain, but with something like wonder. He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the past pressing close, then receding. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "things arrive when we finally stop pretending we don't need them." Noah nodded, tears threatening. He wiped his face with his sleeve and laughed again, breathless. I guess miracles don't always make noise." Walter smiled, a small, private curve of the mouth. Later, when the house had settled and the laptop lay closed once more, Walter moved to the bedroom closet. He opened it slowly, the hinge whispering. The two folded flags waited on the shelf, unchanged. He took them down one at a time and placed them on the bed. His hands trembled as he reached for the photographs he had kept face down for years. He turned the first over. Matthew's smile met him, broad and unguarded, the way it had always been. He turned the second. Jason's eyes looked back, curious and kind, forever young. Walter sat between them, the flags resting against his knees, the photographs balanced in his hands. Ranger stirred, sensing the shift, and rose with effort to join him. The dog placed his head against Walter's prosthetic leg, a familiar gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. Walter rested his hand on Ranger's neck, fingers sinking into the warm fur. "I didn't answer," Walter said softly, "to the photographs, to the dog, to the quiet room. And I'll carry that as long as I'm here." He inhaled slowly, but the boy won't have to. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, leaves whispering like distant voices finally at rest. Walter gathered the photographs and returned them to the shelf, this time facing up. He replaced the flags, careful and reverent, then closed the closet. He returned to the living room and sat in the dark, listening to Ranger's steady breathing, to Noah's quiet movements in his room, to the house that had held them all through loss and grace. He did not need apologies from strangers or recognition from the world. What he needed was here, fragile and stubborn and alive. Walter spoke, one last time, the words, a benediction more than a statement. "I don't need the world to say sorry," he said. "I just need my grandson to live a life his father never got to finish." If this ending left you in stillness, if you believe that God works through quiet courage and unseen mercy, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, where faith reminds us that miracles often arrive without applause. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes they come quietly, through a kind question, a patient heart, or a sacrifice no one sees. This story is a reminder that God often works in ordinary moments, in tired homes, in people who believe they have nothing left to give. When the world looks away, He does not. When prayers are whispered too late, He still listens. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than a story. Share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what faith, sacrifice, or quiet courage means to you. And if you believe that grace can still be found in everyday life, please subscribe to Angels in Uniform so these stories can reach more hearts. May God bless you and your family, give you strength in unseen battles, and remind you that even in silence, He is near.